Most home gardeners are told that if plants look weak, the answer is simple. Buy a better fertilizer, water more often, add one more product, try a different bag, a different bottle, a different promise. And for a while, that seems to work. The leaves green up, the growth comes back, the garden looks better for a few weeks. But then the same problem returns, and now you need even more of the same help just to keep things going. That is the part many people never question. They think the plants are the problem. They think the weather is the problem. They think their garden is just difficult. But often the real issue is much quieter than that. The soil is losing its ability to hold water. It is losing its ability to keep nutrients in place. It is losing the life inside it that makes a garden strong in the first place. So you keep feeding the crop, but the ground beneath it gets weaker every season. That becomes expensive, not only in money, but in effort. You water more, and the soil dries out again. You add fertilizer, and part of it washes away. You compost, but the effect feels temporary. You work harder every year, yet the garden still feels fragile. One hot week, one heavy rain, one missed feeding, and the whole system seems to struggle. That is where many backyard growers quietly give up. Not because they are lazy, not because they do not care, but because they were handed a model that treats soil like an empty container. Put enough in, and something good should come out. But living soil does not work that way. It behaves more like a system than a bucket. And when that system is damaged, more inputs do not always fix it. Sometimes they only hide the weakness for a little longer. There is an older answer to this, a much older one. Long before garden centers, irrigation catalogs, or commercial soil boosters, people were building land that stayed fertile for generations. Not for one season, not for a few years, for centuries. In one part of the world, they created soil so dark, so rich, and so strangely alive that modern scientists were forced to admit something uncomfortable. People without modern technology had figured out a way to make poor ground become permanently better. And the most surprising part is what they used. Not a patented formula, not a rare mineral, not anything you need to order online, just burned plant waste, made in a very particular way. If you understand that system, even at a simple backyard level, you stop thinking only about feeding this week's crop. You begin thinking about building ground that can support your family year after year with less water, fewer purchased inputs, and far more stability than most people think is possible. That is where this story begins. The biggest mistake in home gardening is not a lack of effort, it is a flawed model. Most people were taught to think of soil as something passive. Dirt in a raised bed, dirt in a pot, dirt in a field. If plants are hungry, add nutrients. If they droop, add water. If yields fall, replace what is missing. That sounds reasonable, and sometimes it works for a while, but it trains you to manage symptoms instead of strengthening the system underneath them. That is why so many gardens become dependent. Once the soil loses structure, water moves through too quickly or not at all. Once the biology thins out, nutrients become less available to roots. Once organic matter breaks down without anything stable to support it, the whole growing space becomes reactive. You are no longer working with the soil, you are propping it up. This is not your fault. It is how modern gardening is often sold to ordinary people. Quick result, fast correction, seasonal fix. Most advice focuses on what you should add next, not on how to create ground that becomes more reliable over time. So people assume they need more products, when what they really need is a better foundation. Healthy soil is not just a storage space for roots, it is a living structure. It holds moisture, it buffers temperature changes. It protects nutrients from being lost too quickly. It gives beneficial microbes a place to live. It creates stability. When that stability is present, plants do not need to be rescued so often. They simply grow in a stronger system. That is why some gardens seem easy. Not because those gardeners are lucky, not because their seeds are magical, but because the ground itself is working with them. Water lasts longer. Nutrients stay where roots can reach them. Microbial life supports growth in ways you cannot always see, but you can definitely feel by midsummer when your bed is still producing and someone else's is already tired. The hard truth is this: many people are spending money to replace functions that good soil should already perform. If your ground cannot hold water, you compensate with irrigation. If it cannot hold nutrients, you compensate with feeding. If it lacks life, you compensate with products that promise to wake it back up. That becomes a cycle, and cycles like that can keep a gardener busy for years without ever making the garden truly resilient. The better path is slower, but it is stronger. Instead of asking, what can I pour onto this bed right now? You start asking, what can I build into this soil so it works better next year than it does today? That is a different mindset. It values long-term function over short-term correction. It values systems over quick fixes. And once you see gardening that way, an ancient black soil from the Amazon stops sounding like a strange historical detail and starts sounding like a practical lesson we should have been paying attention to all along. Deep in the Amazon, where many soils are naturally poor and heavily weathered, archaeologists began finding patches of land that did not behave the way they should. The surrounding ground was often acidic and low in nutrients. It could grow things for a while, but not in the sustained, rich, almost effortless way these dark patches could. Yet scattered through the region were areas of black earth so fertile that they stood apart immediately. This soil came to be known as Terra Preta, which simply means black earth. At first that might not sound dramatic, but the deeper researchers looked, the stranger it became. This was not an ordinary natural soil type. It was clearly shaped by human activity. It contained unusually high levels of stable carbon, along with pottery fragments, organic residues, and other signs of long habitation. More importantly, it remained fertile long after the people who created it were gone. That changed the question completely. The mystery was no longer how this land grew so well in the present. The mystery was how it had stayed productive for such an extraordinary length of time. Some of these sites were linked to pre-Columbian communities dating back many centuries, in some cases well over 1,000 years. In practical terms, that meant people had found a way to build fertility into the ground so deeply that the effect outlived them by generations. Modern gardening rarely thinks like that. Most advice is seasonal. Improve this bed for spring, correct this deficiency for summer, add this product before fall. But Terra Preta suggests a very different model. It suggests that human beings can create soil that does not simply receive fertility for a short time. It can retain and organize fertility in a much more lasting way. That is why the discovery matters. It is not just archaeology. It is not just history. It is a direct challenge to the assumption that older farming methods were always crude, primitive, or limited. In this case, people living without industrial tools appear to have built soil systems that modern growers still struggle to reproduce at scale, and they did it in one of the most difficult environments on Earth. That detail matters because it makes the lesson stronger. If this had happened only in naturally rich farmland, it would be less surprising. But when poor tropical soils are transformed into something unusually fertile and durable, you are looking at more than luck. You are looking at a method. Scientists did not find a miracle substance buried there. They found evidence of a practice, a repeatable human action, something ordinary enough to be done again and again, but powerful enough to reshape the character of the soil itself. That is what makes this story so compelling for a backyard gardener. Because once you remove the distance of time and place, the real message becomes clear. The old question is not, how did ancient Amazonians live? The more useful question is, what did they understand about soil that many of us still ignore? The answer begins with fire, but not the kind of fire most people imagine. When people hear that ancient black earth may have started with burned plant matter, many of them picture a simple ash pile. Burn some branches, scatter the remains, and somehow the garden becomes rich. But that is not the system. Ordinary burning destroys too much. If the material burns all the way through in full oxygen, much of the carbon escapes into the air, and what remains is mostly ash. Ash can have uses in small amounts, but it is not the same thing. What made Terra Preta different was not just that something had been burned. It was how it had been burned. This is where the story becomes surprisingly practical. When wood stalks, husks, or dry garden waste are heated with very limited oxygen, they do not burn in the usual way. Instead of turning rapidly into flame and then ash, much of the material is converted into a carbon-rich structure. Lightweight, dark, full of tiny pores, stable enough to remain in the soil for a very long time. Today we call that material biochar. That word sounds modern, but the idea is ancient. And once you understand it, many things begin to make sense. Why the soil stayed dark, why it held onto fertility, why it supported life so well, why it did not fade away after a few rainy seasons. The carbon was not there as a passing ingredient. It was there as a framework. That is the part many people miss. Biochar is not mainly plant food by itself. It does not behave like a strong fertilizer that forces rapid growth on its own. Its power is quieter than that. It changes the conditions around the roots. It gives water more places to stay. It gives nutrients more surfaces to cling to. It gives beneficial microbes protected shelter in the ground. In other words, it helps the whole soil system function better. That is why the effect can feel almost disproportionate. A gardener looks at a handful of black material and wonders how something so simple could matter much. But the secret is not in bulk. It is in structure. A porous carbon piece may look small from the outside, but internally it contains an enormous amount of surface area. That is what turns it from a piece of char into a kind of long-lasting habitat. Now, the Amazon story sounds less mystical. Ancient people may not have used laboratory language, but they likely understood results through observation. They would have seen that certain residues from controlled burning improve the ground in a lasting way. They would have noticed better moisture, better growth, better resilience. Over time, a practice becomes tradition, and tradition, repeated long enough, can produce a landscape that seems almost unbelievable to those who no longer remember how it was made. This is where the old black soil stops being an ancient curiosity and becomes a practical clue. Because the same principle can be used in a modern backyard, at a small scale, with dry prunings, sticks, stems, and other waste many gardeners already have. Not as a trick, not as a miracle, as a method. And once you understand what that carbon structure is really doing inside the soil, you begin to see why so many people feel their beds are always thirsty, always hungry, and always one step away from decline. The real power of biochar comes from what happens during low oxygen heating and what that leaves behind. When dry plant material is heated in a limited oxygen environment, the volatile compounds are driven off and much of the remaining structure becomes concentrated carbon. But unlike a dense chunk of coal, good biochar is full of microscopic spaces, tiny channels, cavities, irregular surfaces, places where water can sit, where nutrients can be held, and where microbial life can settle in relative safety. That changes the behavior of soil in three very important ways. First, it helps with water, not in a magical way, not by creating water from nowhere, but by improving the soil's ability to hold moisture in a more balanced way. In sandy or tired soils, water can move through too quickly. In hard soils, it may run off or pool unevenly. Biochar adds a kind of buffering structure. Think of it as a sponge-like framework mixed into the ground. After rain or irrigation, some of that moisture remains available around the root zone instead of disappearing so fast. Second, it helps with nutrients. Many nutrients are mobile. Nitrogen especially can be lost easily, and other dissolved minerals can move below the root zone after watering or heavy rain. Biochar's surface area gives those nutrients more places to attach and linger. That does not mean it replaces compost or natural feeding. It means the things you add are more likely to stay in the system long enough to do useful work. Over time, that can reduce waste and help explain why some growers see less need for repeated feeding. Third, it helps with biology. Good soil is alive. Bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms are not decorations. They are part of the engine. They help break materials down, cycle nutrients, and support root health. Biochar gives these organisms shelter. Inside those protected spaces, microbial communities can establish themselves more effectively than in a bare, unstable medium. That matters because healthy biology often makes the difference between a garden that constantly needs correction and one that begins to regulate itself more naturally. This is why raw biochar is usually best thought of as something to prepare before use. Many experienced gardeners do not simply throw fresh char straight into a bed and walk away. They moisten it. They mix it with compost, manure, worm castings, or diluted nutrient-rich liquids first. Some let it sit for days or weeks. The reason is simple. Biochar works best when it enters the soil already carrying life and fertility. not as an empty carbon shell. Once charged that way, it becomes much more effective as part of the soil system. This is also why the method has attracted serious attention in agriculture and climate discussions. In some studies, biochar has been linked to meaningful yield improvement, better nutrient efficiency, and reduced fertilizer demand depending on crop, soil type, and application method. Some reports have shown around 25% improvement in yields under the right conditions, along with lower nitrogen requirements in the early years. Results vary, as they always do in real soil, but the direction is hard to ignore. What matters most for the ordinary gardener is not the headline number. It is the principle underneath it. You are taking waste material from the backyard. You are converting it into a stable form of carbon. You are combining it with living fertility. Then you are putting it back into the ground in a way that makes the whole soil more capable of supporting itself. That is not a seasonal trick. That is system building. And systems like that tend to reward patience. One reason this subject has become so interesting to scientists, growers, and environmental groups is that biochar sits at the meeting point of three problems many people care about: soil degradation, rising input costs, carbon in the atmosphere. Usually those issues are discussed separately, but biochar connects them. From a gardening point of view, the value is practical: better soil structure, better moisture retention, better nutrient use. In field trials and controlled studies, researchers have often found that biochar can improve crop performance when matched to the right soil and combined with other fertility sources. The exact outcome depends on the crop, the climate, the soil condition, and how the char is prepared. But the overall pattern has kept serious attention on the method for years. From a climate point of view, the logic is just as interesting. When plant material rots or burns completely, much of its carbon returns to the atmosphere relatively quickly. But when part of that biomass is converted into stable char and then placed in soil, a portion of the carbon can remain there for a very long time. That is why biochar is often discussed as one of the more realistic carbon storage tools available. It does not solve everything. Nothing does. But it takes material that would usually be treated as waste and turns part of it into something stable, useful, and long-lasting. That is an unusual combination. In many modern systems, environmental benefit and practical benefit are treated as if they belong to different worlds. One helps the planet but costs the grower more. One helps the grower but comes with a larger environmental burden. Biochar is interesting because it can do both when handled properly. It can improve the performance of a backyard or farm soil while also keeping some carbon out of the atmosphere for much longer than ordinary decomposition would. That is not hype. It is simply why so much investment and research continue to flow into this area. And yet the basic principle remains surprisingly accessible. That is what makes it so appealing for ordinary people. You do not need an industrial facility to understand the concept. At a household level, the lesson is still the same as it was centuries ago. Waste biomass is not always waste. Under the right conditions, it becomes infrastructure for the soil. There is something deeply reassuring in that, because it means independence does not always begin with buying something new. Sometimes it begins with seeing old materials differently: dry branches from pruning, stalks, twigs, yard trimmings. The very things many people pile up and haul away can become part of a longer-term plan to strengthen the land under their feet. And once you start thinking that way, gardening changes. You stop seeing every season as a new struggle that starts from zero. You begin to see each season as a chance to build capacity, a little more water-holding ability, a little more biological life, a little less dependence on bags and bottles, a little more resilience when weather turns difficult. That kind of progress is not flashy, but it is the kind that lasts. At the backyard level, this does not need to be complicated. One of the simplest ways people make small batches of biochar is by using a basic metal container, often something like an old steel drum or a smaller metal can adapted for safe outdoor use. The idea is not to create a giant fire. The idea is to create controlled burning with limited oxygen so the material chars instead of disappearing into ash. A common low-cost approach is a top-lit, updraft-style burn. Dry biomass goes into the container. Small sticks, prunings, husks, or other untreated garden waste can work well as long as the material is dry enough to char cleanly. The fire is started from the top rather than the bottom. That sounds backward at first, but it helps the upper layer burn, while gases from the lower layers rise through the flame zone. In simple terms, it allows the process to move downward in a more controlled way. You watch it carefully. Too much oxygen for too long, and the char begins to burn away. Too little heat, and the process stalls. This is why small batches are useful when you are learning. You begin to recognize the look of properly charred material. Lightweight, black. Structured, not gray ash, not half-burned wood. Something in between, but stable. Once the charring stage is complete, the process is stopped by quenching with water or covering in a way that cuts off oxygen, depending on the setup. Safety matters here. This is outdoor work. It needs distance from structures, dry grass, and anything flammable. Common sense matters more than speed. After that, the char is usually crushed to a workable size. Then comes the part that many beginners overlook: charging it. Fresh char is best mixed with something biologically active before it goes into the garden. Compost is a good option. Aged manure can work. Worm castings are excellent. Even soaking crushed char in diluted compost tea or another mild nutrient solution can help. Let it absorb moisture and fertility. Let living organisms begin to occupy those pores. When it enters the bed this way, it becomes much more helpful much more quickly. At a household scale, the cost can be very low. If the container is reused scrap metal and the feedstock is garden waste you already have, the main cost is time and attention. Compare that with commercial biochar, which can sell for the equivalent of $15 to $25 per kilogram in some markets. And you can see why the homemade approach has become so attractive. The material is not mysterious. What matters is learning the method and using it carefully. Then you start small. One bed, one border, one section near heavy feeders like tomatoes, squash, or corn. You observe moisture. You observe growth. You compare that area with the rest of the garden over a full season, not a weekend. That is how practical growers learn what works. Quietly, repeatedly, without needing to make grand claims before the results are there. That kind of approach builds confidence. And confidence built on observation tends to last longer than confidence built on advertising. The deeper lesson in all of this is not really about charcoal. It is about time. Modern gardening often pushes you to think in very short cycles. Fix this deficiency now, boost this crop now, correct this problem now. There are moments when that is necessary, but if that becomes your whole model, the garden never becomes truly secure. It stays dependent on constant intervention. It stays vulnerable to every heat wave, every missed watering, every price increase at the store. A stronger system asks a different question. What can you do this season that will still be helping you next season, in the season after that? Biochar matters because it fits that question so well. Once properly prepared and incorporated, it does not vanish like a quick feeding. It becomes part of the long-term architecture of the soil. That means the benefits are not only about this year's tomatoes or beans, they are about building a backyard that holds together better over time. More stable moisture, better nutrient retention, more room for life in the soil, less waste, less dependence. For a family that matters, not in an abstract way, in a grocery bill way, in a summer water bill way, in the quiet relief of knowing your beds are getting stronger instead of weaker. Even modest improvements in yield and reliability can add up when repeated over several seasons. A garden that produces more consistently with fewer purchased inputs gives you something many people are looking for now, whether they use that word or not: independence. Not total independence. That is not realistic for most people, but meaningful independence. Enough to matter. Enough to feel that your backyard is not just a hobby space, it is a working system, a small piece of resilience, a place where waste becomes value, where soil improves instead of depletes, and where knowledge replaces at least some of the dependence people have been told is unavoidable. That may be the most powerful part of the ancient Amazon lesson. Those people were not waiting for a company to solve their soil problem. They were observing, adapting, repeating, and building fertility into the land itself. Modern science can help explain why it worked, and that is useful. But the core truth remains beautifully simple. A patient, low-cost system can sometimes outperform an expensive, high-input habit. So if this idea speaks to you, do not try to change your whole property at once. Start with one bed, use one small batch. Mix it well with compost. Watch what happens through heat, rain, and harvest. Let the garden teach you what the old Black Earth taught others a very long time ago. Good systems do not usually announce themselves loudly. They prove themselves slowly.